Welcome to Press Review with me, Iain Martin, editor of Reaction. I'm joined by my colleagues from the Reaction team, Maggie, Pagano and Mark Fox. Press Review is the show where we pick the stories that have caught our eye in the last week or so from around the world and which we think illuminate bigger trends and explain interesting things that are happening in the world. Who wants to go first? Mark, I think you had the first story, a pick from the Financial Times.
Well, Chris Giles has interviewed Hugh Pill, the new chief economist at the Bank of England. And it's a big interview, really good interview. But in it, he seems to me to be flagging quite a dramatic departure from what the bank and others have been saying, where he warns about inflation hitting 5%, if not more. And this is one of those stories, isn't it, Iain and Maggie, that we sort of all think we know because we sense it in our weekly shop. And if anybody's gone to the petrol pump, which I did earlier, right, which was enough of a shock, had to have a lie down and take oxygen afterwards. We all sort of know prices are going up and think, but the sort of the bank and our politicians have been sort of playing it down and saying it's temporary, it's all a bit of a blip. Yeah. But Hugh Pill is very clearly preparing the country for a pretty substantial and longer lasting increase in inflation than we have been used to having in recent time.
Yeah, it's a really good pick, and it is a good interview by Chris Giles. But there's something very interesting has happened in the markets this week where they are, because of course the implication that inflation is not as transient as it seemed and is going to be longer lasting then has knock-on implications for the bank's policy on interest rates. So essentially what people want to know is, are interest rates about to rise? And yes, they are. They're about to start nudging upwards. But if you look at the way that the short and long markets, the sort of the bets that traders and investors are making or have made this week, they seem to anticipate a short-term spike in interest rates, sort of slightly higher than people anticipated, but then longer term falling away. So it's difficult to work out. It may be, as someone who works in that world said to me, it may be that the markets are that those in the markets are calculating that the bank will have to sort of overreact, and then there'll be some sort of further economic shock, which will mean they'll have to go to looser policy, later next year or the year after. How do you read it, Maggie?
Confused. I think, and I'm wondering whether actually that's not what they're aiming to do. Until the last few weeks, the idea was we wouldn't have interest rate rises until at least next spring. It was definitely 2022. And then Andrew Bailey a couple of weeks ago hinted, didn't he, when he spoke to central governors, that it might be sooner than later. And of course, the MPC meets on November the 4th. And from what I can gather, it's quite divided. There are at least two members who've said that putting up interest rates now would be damaging to the economy, just as we're moving out of and into recovery stage. Some people are even saying it would tip us into recession. Others want to see a short, sharp jolt, as you're just saying, to try and halt inflation. I'm not sure it would make any difference at all. And so I'm sort of wondering, the markets are anticipating it, and maybe that's what they wanted them to do, so that the markets are doing some of the work for them. There is another view, and I'm so sorry because I can't remember where I read it, but a very good analysis, and everyone's been saying, the US and in Britain, saying this is temporary, transitory. Well, if you look at what's happened in the supply chains, it's been because of a rise in the disruption in supply chains leading to energy rises and so forth. It's been because of an excess demand. The demand has put pressure on, whether it's in China, output and so forth, not as a consequence of things going wrong. So the temporary argument is, so once they meet that demand, then actually we'll start to see it even out. I don't know whether that is the correct analysis, but it's certainly something to take on board.
But Iain, I think that Maggie's dog is really reflecting, right, my sense of this. You and Maggie, of course, are great city watchers and gurus and viewers. Iain's written a couple of very good books, and if you haven't bought them, please do, because he needs the money, right? But the fact is that city watching is about par, isn't it, with going down to the casino with a bunch of £10 notes and putting it on red and
Nonsense.
hoping that it comes up.
Yeah.
But the really interesting thing about this, for me, is the political implications, right? Because for a prime minister who defies political gravity on a sustained basis so far, it's amazing.
Yeah.
But we have not had tested in recent decades a prime minister and a government who has had to face real increases in real costs in people's weekly shop and their everyday living, and how resilient and how immune to feeling fed up with that the electorate will be. So for me, it's a very frontline issue.
That's a good point. It's a good point. I think it. Yes, it's a real test. But I do think after the events of the last couple of years, it's fascinating to see people who would usually be making very strong declarations about what's about to happen in the economy. It's obviously there's enormous inflation coming. It's it's because of central bank policy. People are, as you said, Maggie, confused and watching and waiting to see. I mean, Chris Giles, who wrote that piece in the FT and interviewed Hugh Pill, that's a good get, and we're going to be hearing a lot more from Hugh Pill in the next couple of years. Of course, he's taken over from Andy Haldane at the Bank of England, so he's going to become a big figure, and public's going to see a lot more of him. Also, I always think. I mean, Chris Giles is a writer, although I don't always agree with him, or don't always agree with his with the policy positions that he takes. He is very skilled. I always think back to the groundbreaking profile he did of Mervyn King, which infuriated Mervyn King's allies. But so that was Chris Giles in the FT. Maggie, you've got a selection of things which illustrate one story, which is this amazing story relating to Poland and the EU.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I've sort of gone for a triple decker here because it gives a sense of the timeline of what's happened this week. So the first explanatory piece is from Politico, from two great journalists, Suzanne Lynch and Jakob Hanke-Vella, hope I got his name pronounced correctly, who set out on Tuesday what the debate was about. And then my second piece is from Facts for EU, or Facts for You, which gives the transcript of Ursula von der Leyen and the Polish Prime Minister it actually clashing in Strasbourg earlier this week. And then today's piece from Joe Barnes, Brussels correspondent from The Telegraph, who is giving the response when Angela Merkel yesterday is trying to quell this debate. So very briefly, what has happened is, as most people will know, the Polish High Court ruled that laws made in Poland are sovereign and over and above primacy beyond the EU. This, as you can imagine, went down like a ton of bricks with our friends in Brussels. And as we know, there have been disputes between the two over the years. But what was so different this time was the way the president of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, hit back at the Polish Prime Minister and threatened punitive action, i.e. withholding some of the money going from the recovery fund and so forth. And what the Facts for You piece does is it gives the transcripts of both their speeches, which haven't been translated elsewhere into English yet, and they really make for quite damning reading. So this is not, I think people talking about Polexit far too soon. I don't think, most of the Polish people don't want it. That's not about, I don't think that's the interesting point about the story. The interesting point is, who is it, nation states or the legal foundation of the EU that has primacy?
Well, that was absolutely that was noteworthy in terms of Angela Merkel's remarks, where she speculated on this. This seems a bit late in the day, post Brexit, and after everything that's happened in the EU and during her tenure, to say, well, this is the great discussion: is it more nation states or is it ever closer union? I can imagine David Cameron's face when he's sort of having this great dawning realization. That's
maybe she learned a little bit from Brexit.
Partly, but as the Germans like to say, well, not everything is about Brexit or the Brits here, but there does seem to be something fundamental going on in the European Union, and I think it's partly because it is Poland, because Poland. Remember, of course, Britain was the country that was very much an advocate of expansion of the EU enlargement, and the idea was that enlargement was going to dilute the EU or dilute the demand for ever closer union. And it's very important to the EU that Poland stays in, and it's always been caught historically between Germany and Russia, and for obvious reasons, chooses the West and wants to align with the West, but then now its government finds in large parts of its population a lot of the European ideal, while it likes being in the EU and likes the sort of protection of the West. There's a lot of discomfort with the positions that the EU is taking. Also, some of the polls, opinion polls that is, have shifted a little bit. I mean, there's still overwhelming support for staying in. So I'm not predicting Polexit, as you put it, Maggie, but something is stirring.
On that point, sorry, just very quickly. I mean, that's exactly it. They're very unhappy with the way Germany has cozied up to Russia on Nord Stream and so forth. And actually, a large part of the Prime Minister's speech was about the energy crisis, which they can't control, and about environmental laws, because it will damage their economy just so badly.
And it was an electric moment in the chamber, which doesn't happen very often in the European Parliament. But when the Polish Premier read out a list of statements defending constitutional integrity and sovereignty, and he even said, "Look, I can see by your faces that you're not particularly enjoying hearing this." But he played a very clever trick, which is that the statements that he read out were statements said by the Spanish and by the Italians and by various other
Germans
governments, emphasizing that point. So he played a very clever rhetorical trick. Mark, you were going to say?
Well, I'm bursting to say, because of course I'm in the presence of two mighty Brexiteers, and of course we spent a long time talking about an organisation, a faraway organisation about which we know increasingly little. But it comes in the week, doesn't it, where it looks as though the Prime Minister is going to agree a certain degree of European court sovereignty and jurisdiction over Northern Ireland, although it will be dressed up with an arbitration panel and a sort of all of that. The fact is that at the end of the day, if the reports are true, it looks as though Boris Johnson is going to agree with the European Union that the European Court has a role to play on Northern Ireland issues, where it will have supremacy over domestic UK courts.
Well, we'll see. And of course,
I thought that would send your
the position you've just mapped out there in rather hysterical terms, Mark, is the position that the UK government signed up to when it signed the protocol and the Brexit deal. But the reality is that, as various people have made clear, the British were signing up to it, and Brexiteers were voting for it just to try and end the farce, and then hope to sort some of it out later. I mean, we'll see on that, actually. I mean, I suspect those reports are correct, and there'll be some form of compromise patched together. I don't think a trade war suits anyone, but we'll find out soon enough.
Swiftly on.
Can I very quickly, for the record and on the
record, I traduced you, Maggie? I'm sorry, I've traduced you.
No, you haven't traduced me, but you misinformed. I voted for Remain.
Dear, you'll be getting your P45 from the editor.
No, I think Iain knows this. But but I was on the fence. I could have gone either way easily. But what we should have done, of course, is stayed in the EEA, and we wouldn't have any of these problems with Northern Ireland.
Okay, now we've lost about 5,000 subscribers.
Right, we're moving there into a sort of generalised Brexit discussion. No one wants to rerun the referendum and all of that nastiness. And this is press review, where we don't just have generalised political discussions. We flag up the stories and writers, podcasts as well, and broadcasts that have grabbed us in the last week or so from around the world. So it's not just the UK. My next pick is actually, I mean, closer to home, but it is a global story, is from Reaction, which is Tim Marshall, our columnist, best-selling author, Power of Geography, Prisoners of Geography, amazing author, writes every Friday for Reaction on geopolitics for Reaction members, and his most recent column, it's in response to a story which broke last weekend, is about the fabled hypersonic missiles that the Chinese allegedly fired, which of course they say was really just a conventional spacecraft or space vehicle of some sort, but which does seem to have spooked the Pentagon and others. And it's a typically terrific column from Tim, but it makes a very, and we will come on to some good news in a moment, but it makes a rather scary point about the nuclear deterrent and the defense doctrine, which hadn't really occurred to me before. And as Tim says in the piece, that in the old world of nuclear weapons, of sort of relatively slow moving weaponry, there was at least some time of slack in the system for powers to warn each other or to diffuse a situation. So you think, and he mentions Dr. Strangelove, there is time, even if it doesn't work, spoiler alert, for the president of the United States and the Russian leadership to have a telephone conversation. And there are examples from the last 40, 50 years where leaders can communicate and diffuse a situation. If we're moving to hypersonic missiles and some doubt about whether they would have nuclear capacity or conventional capacity, you create another potential for misunderstanding, but things happening, and the world is moving ever faster, it seems, with technology, things going wrong at high speed. I don't know what to say beyond that, other than what a cheering thought that is. But it's a terrific piece by Tim. Mark, do you want to come in on that, from the defence point of view?
Well, I just think that it is a superb piece, and Tim's just fantastic, as we know. But I think it just brings into sharp relief the sort of the increasing polarization and sort of divide that is growing between Russia, China, and large elements of the West. You know, we had a couple of weeks ago the AUKUS thing signed, which was led by the navies of Australia and Britain, followed by the politicians, with America involved, which was really important, although it's annoyed the French polity massively. I mean, the French politicians are so cross, but you can see why Washington and London wanted to do it, and why it has traction. And also the threat from Russia is increasing. You know, we know about Russia is a real global leader in underwater submarine technology and activity. Right, we tend to look at its old aircraft carrier and laugh as it chugs its way around, belching smoke, and it can't get planes on it. But the fact is that under the water, they're absolutely state of the art, and we are racing. And China, I think I read this week in one of the papers that China was producing ships that accounted for the size of, what was it, France, Britain, and Australia every 5 months or something, the size of their combined navies. Yeah. I mean, it's massive. Absolutely massive. So Tim's thing is part of a piece as technology rapidly moves ahead into these new areas. And I think it's come up on us slightly because we haven't been concentrating, generally speaking, because of the pandemic and, for us, Brexit and lots of other things. But this international sparring and tension is certainly increasing again.
Yep. So, Mark, I'm going to come back to you in 1 second for some good news. But if you're not a subscriber to Reaction on YouTube, you're watching Press Review, hit the subscribe button below, and also like this video if indeed you do like this video. If you're not a subscriber to Reaction, our main site, and you want Tim Marshall's column, Maggie Pagano's brilliant column on business and other things, and my weekly newsletter on politics and all the other work that the team does. You go to the site, the address is below, and you can become an annual member. There's an offer on at the moment. Mark, some good news, cheer us up, about the Queen.
Well, I'm just going to introduce this around the Queen by saying, of course, this week we have been celebrating Trafalgar Day. And we all know, well, Iain won't because he's Scottish, but Maggie will know, this is the greatest Englishman of all time, Nelson,
Absolutely.
whose great trick was, of course, always, wasn't it, to sail through the enemy's line. And that actually gave me pause to think about two stories, actually, I was going to say, one very happy and one sad. One is very happy because it's the news that the Queen, although she had such a busy week this week, has had to cancel her trip to celebrate the centenary of Northern Ireland, and that it turns out that she spent a night in hospital. But it seems to be that she's back at her desk, as Windsor Castle is very keen to point out. That
yeah. Can I just interrupt? Can I just interrupt you there, Mark? Just on one point on that, related to that story, because this has caused a bit of a media storm, hasn't it? Well, firstly, as you say, it's good news. She's 95 and she's back home and apparently in good spirits. A story in the Times by Valentine Low this afternoon, which is Palace condemned for keeping Queen's hospital stay secret, and this is the BBC's royal correspondent Nicholas Witchell being furious, it seems, and questioning how much the palace could be trusted, because this was kept secret and then only revealed by the Sun. How do you feel about that, Mark and Maggie?
So
do we have a right to know? I mean, she's our head of state.
So you know that old saying they used to say, oh, the head butler at Buckingham Palace is always grander than the monarch, right? Royal correspondents tend to be the grandest of grand correspondents, right? It's a bit like meeting the imperial household if you meet any royal correspondent, which, of course, the great Nicholas Witchell, and indeed the sainted Robert Hardman, who was on the Today programme this morning.
I was just going to exclude Robert Hardman from your evisceration, actually.
Look, I teased him because I used to make a good living out of writing royal stories myself when I was a practicing journalist, so I do not poo-poo the thing. But the truth is that we're dealing here with a very remarkable 95-year-old person who has had an extremely busy week by any standards. I think she's the head of state, the monarch. The idea that she can go for a private visit anywhere outside of her own private apartments in her homes is absurd. And I think, Iain, all this is all a bit artificial, right? The palace is doing what the palace always does. The palace knows that if the Queen goes to hospital and stays the night, and they say it was unexpected, but surprise, surprise, somebody managed to rustle up a toothbrush and a nightdress and all the kit and caboodle, the phone and all this, right? So take it with a pinch of salt. You will never know for years to come the truth of it. But the truth is the palace knows that everybody will get to know about it. Probably other royal correspondents are as more cross about the fact that the Sun had it, if we're being honest about it, than the Buckingham Palace trying to hide it. But I think all that is complete hoo-ha about nothing. The key thing is she's back at home at Windsor Castle. We hope that she's in robust good health, but it is a reminder to us that she's 95.
It is, but also, Maggie, it is a reminder that she's. I mean, this may be because the monarch is determined to carry on being active and be as engaged as possible, which is obviously a positive thing. But I was very struck this week by, and there were, I think, pictures from the event that the government, because the government, of course, who are in bad odor with business globally and big business in the UK, were delighted that the Queen and other senior members of the royal family, but particularly the Queen, who's always a great lure for business leaders, turned up for this global investment summit on Tuesday. And she wasn't there for very long for the evening reception. She was in a kind of side room, I understand, so I'm told. and lots of people who thought they were going to meet the Queen didn't get to meet the Queen, so it is said, which strikes me as completely crazy in the context of her being 95 and is going into a COVID, flu and cold winter. And as someone at Westminster pointed out to me, not only is the political class of the government prepared to have the Queen there to aid its green investment plans before COP26, the plan, I think I'm right in saying, is for her to go to COP26 along with 30,000 other people from 200 countries, which strikes me as potentially a great sort of November Petri dish in Glasgow, because the government obviously wants the most famous person in the world there. But that am I being alarmist? It just strikes me as completely daft to expect her to go.
I suspect that she probably won't go after this scare, don't you think?
I hope not.
But in terms of, can I just go back to your very beginning? You said, people feel they should have a right to know. There's absolutely no right to know. And I think the palace were right. Everyone would have gone bonkers. There would have been the whole world's press outside the hospital. What really astonished me about the story is, I mean, what would she go into a hospital for? What sort of tests? So would it be heart monitors, cardiograms or whatever? I'm so surprised that they wouldn't be able to take all that to Buck House or to Windsor Castle to do the tests there. That's actually the bit that surprised me about the story. Yeah. But in terms of wheeling her out, I suspect that she'll be advised not to go to Glasgow.
Wheeling her out, Maggie? Wheeling her out? You're talking about the Queen, Her Majesty. Yes, I suspect that we are.
Yes, Maggie. This is you're not in a Fleet Street newsroom.
Sorry,
this is.
Can I just say she also has a divine right? I thought it was very interesting. She does believe utterly in the divine right of her rule, and she will go on until she literally drops, and that's so admirable, I think.
Yep.
So
let's Mark, you're going to move on to we're going to move on
very firm chair, isn't it, Maggie?
Just on the question of, and this is not a much less happy subject than the Queen being hale and hearty, assisted dying, and you wanted to flag up the story from the BBC about Frank Field.
Well, I did, because the news has come through, reported by the BBC, as you say, Ian, that Frank Field's made a statement that he's in the process of dying. We've known that he's not been well on and off for some time, and we sort of, and he's a good age, but nevertheless, it's terribly sad because he's just immensely distinguished and, effective and charismatic Westminster politician who's fought some of Labour's hardest battles through the years of militant and all of that, and fought and kept his seat in Birkenhead, and was just such a champion of the disadvantaged and the vulnerable and the weak, and a really sort of decent sort of a person. And Frank Field, being Frank Field, is not shy about, issuing a statement and explaining what's happening, and so, as we would expect from him, being very courageous. Yeah. But it's a moment to pause, and we all have known him, haven't we, Ian and Maggie? And we know that very rare people of his decency and courage and resilience make it through a whole career in politics.
No, you're right. You're absolutely right, Mark. One of my favourite people at Westminster, it is, as you say, very sad. His statement was read out by Baroness Meacher in the House of Lords during this. It's a private member's bill during this debate taking place on Friday on the question of introducing assisted dying. I interviewed Lord Forsyth for reaction on YouTube on this question, because Michael Forsyth has changed his mind on the subject after effectively his father, who was dying in considerable pain, said, "I blame you." A very tough thing to hear. That what he meant was he blamed legislators who had for years not done something about this particular question. Maggie, you disagree with the attempt at changing the law?
I do. I don't. It's quite a simple view that I have, which is that we didn't choose when we come into this world, and I don't think it's for us all those around us to choose when we depart. And I don't think it's the role of the state to be part of it. And in many ways, it sort of happens anyway in many situations. And I think that it just opens up so many. It happened. What I mean is, people are assisted. You know, we have nil by mouth. We all know of cases of how it can be taken out. I mean, it's a really touchy, very sensitive, very tricky subject. But my instinct is that we should leave it as it is.
It is very difficult, and I think lots of us have been wrestling with it. I mean, I have to say that my mind has been changing on this for the last couple of years, and I think that Michael Forsyth's comments were, I thought, so coherent and so well delivered that I think that they were, in my case, decisive in changing my mind. Well, I can still see the arguments, and I respect the slippery slope argument, the potential that it could create what some commentators call, a culture of death. But I think what is being talked about here is really specific, and it is pain that can be avoided, and I think the safeguards are perfectly feasible. And I just think that things are shifting in this direction, so that even if the law doesn't change this time, I think that's where things are going. It's also going to be, I mean, we're not talking here about specific pieces here in press review, because there'll be a lot written over the weekend, I think. It's a rare example of Parliament actually leading the way here, and I think there'll be a lot of interesting writing done over the coming days and weeks, which we'll get we'll examining again, and I'm sure we'll discuss this issue in more detail another time. I just want to wrap up with one final piece that I wanted to highlight, which is from the Financial Times again, which we mentioned at the beginning, but this is something completely different, which is a magazine story from Henry Manse, which is Inside John Lewis, and it's just a fabulous piece of reporting and analysis, which grapples with, and I'd love to hear your views about John Lewis. The question: what on earth is to become of this extraordinary brand, such a big part of British life? And he explains through the history, really, why it's become central to the British middle class way of life, and just the terrible forces of people from the digital economy will say these are not terrible forces, these are just market forces, but it's being turned upside down by digital retailing. And there is this question now, just as Henry frames it very well, in the modern world, in the digital world, do you need John Lewis? I mean, it's a great personal regret to me. It's something I look to as a sort of staple of British life, though feel less and less need to go there. Maggie?
It's a wonderful radio recording that John Spedden Lewis did with the BBC in about 1955. He was in his 80s, and he explained why he, in 1929, I think it was, why they chose, or the father chose, to give him or give the company to the employees. And he said it was something to the effect of, we've got to find a middle way. We've got the Bolsheviks in Russia trying to control the economy with the communism. Here in Britain, we've got the sort of managerial capitalists. I think that was the expression. We want to find another way. It was a really wonderful and quite revolutionary form of ownership. And it's sort of paradoxical. It's become this totemic thing of the British middle classes, and always on the side of the angels. So I think there will always be, hopefully they'll keep that ownership structure, and they'll have to adapt. They'll have to find the middle way again between capitalism. I mean, actually they're doing very well on online. They're adapting their online very quickly.
Belatedly,
so,
yeah.
Yeah, belatedly. Well, Andy Street would argue that actually 10 years ago he was setting the pace, but it's a tricky.
Andy Street was now, is
Andy Street
now in politics, but was running
managing
was running
director of John
Lewis, yeah.
Lewis. I suspect they overexpanded a bit with Waitrose and some of the pricing. They got their pricing wrong. But the John Lewis stores, I think there is a role, but it will be a smaller, more contained.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think on that basis, we're going to wrap up this edition of Press Review. I'm Iain Martin, editor of Reaction, joined by Mark Fox and Maggie Pagano, my colleagues from Reaction. You've been watching Press Review, which is the show where we highlight the stories that have grabbed us in the last 7 days or so. If you're not a subscriber to Reaction on YouTube, just click the button and become one. And also, if you go to the main site, you can get my weekly newsletter if you become a member of Reaction, and also Maggie's column and lots more from the rest of the team. Until next time, thank you for watching and listening.